The Denver Broncos are set to report for training camp at the UCL Training Center in just 2 weeks. We continue our position preview series focusing on the defensive side of the ball, kicking things off with the cornerback position. Who are the key additions, subtractions, and what are the storylines for the cornerback position in 2021? We break it all down from the South Stands to the end zone on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back into a brand new episode of the show. Locked On Broncos is your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked On NFL Network, your team every day. I'm Cody Roark, host of the show, director of video content at Pro Football Network, and Broncos analyst for the Locked On NFL Network. You can follow me on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL. Follow the show at Locked On Broncos. Like us on all social media feeds. Also, Facebook has now incorporated a brand new podcasting feature. So if you're on Facebook, you can actually listen to Locked On Broncos within the Facebook app with their new podcast feature. Check out the Locked On Broncos Facebook page to be able to access every single episode on the go, wherever you are at. But Broncos country, today's episode of the show is brought to you by our good friends over there, rockauto.com. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts that your car will ever need. rockauto.com. I'll tell you about them a little bit later on as the show progresses. But ladies and gentlemen, we're continuing our position preview series before training camp. We focused on the offensive side of the ball a couple of weeks ago. Now we transition to the defensive side of the ball. One of my favorite sides of the ball. I might have a bias there because I was a defensive player. I played a little bit of offense, but mainly I was a defensive guy playing cornerback. So we're going to start things off today with the cornerback position, ladies and gentlemen. Last season, the storyline coming into the offseason, the Broncos' depth at cornerback was so deeply tested and just injuries piled up towards the end of the year. You had Parnell Motley and Ajimundi starting in the Week 17 regular season finale against the Las Vegas Raiders. The depth was so depleted. Now, the Broncos enter 2021. It's not the case at this point in time with all the additions that they made. And I also just touched on this as well in my latest article of their 9news.com. Click on the Broncos tab. You'll see my latest about the Broncos secondary depth and why now it is a good problem for them to have. But let's talk about some of the key additions this offseason for the Broncos in the cornerback room specifically. I think we have to go to free agency first off and foremost. The first move for the Broncos was going out and getting Ronald Darby to a 3-year deal. Now, for Darby coming into this Broncos defense, coming off of a career year for him in the Washington football team on one of the NFL's best defenses last year, might I add, his athleticism, his speed is something that stands out to me. I had a chance to interview him in a press conference before mandatory minicamp had concluded, and he even said that for him, he believes that his speed is going to be something in terms of his trait that people are going to notice in Vic Fangio's defense. He's going to be that speed guy. So anytime the Broncos need to match up maybe with a Tyreek Hill, we may see Ronald Darby assign coverage on him just because he is fast. And one thing I went back on the film with Darby, his reaction, his ability to break on the ball quickly. He's very disciplined, specifically watching him against Michael Gallup, Amari Cooper last year, and even CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. He put on some really fun things on film that should have Broncos fans excited coming into this season. Obviously, a great veteran addition there. The concern for him, I think, amongst Broncos fans is when they look at his prior history, he's been injured in various seasons with Philadelphia Eagles, the Buffalo Bills, but he maintained a full-on season last year, didn't miss any games. He had a whole entire season under his belt. So Ronald Darby, if he could stay healthy, he's going to play a role in Vic Fangio's defense this year. One of the other additions, too, Kyle Fuller. He was shortly released by the Chicago Bears. Now, initially, he didn't appear on the transaction wire, so the Chicago Bears held on to him a little bit. They tried to trade him. There was no market there in terms of taking on his contract. So he was a cap casualty. He was released. And then within moments after the release, the Broncos swooped in and signed him. Obviously, the Vic Fangio ties there. He didn't really attend the voluntary OTAs, but he did appear for mandatory minicamp for the Broncos and getting up to speed a little bit. Wearing number 23, he switched off with Michael Ajimundi. Now, OJ is going to be wearing a different number this season, number 13. So we'll talk about Michael Ajimundi a little bit later on as the show progresses here, but that's one of the other key additions. Now, Patrick Surtain in the NFL draft, first-round draft selection, 9th pick overall for the Denver Broncos. They selected him. And the thing with Patrick Surtain, going back, I went through some interviews that Nick Saban did at Alabama leading up to the draft process, even post-draft. He just said that he is a coach's dream because he's a guy that is so disciplined. He's so attention to detail. He's one of the most cerebral players, and he studies the playbook. And then it came as no surprise to find out that he was going through in mandatory minicamp, rookie minicamp, going through this motion of learning every single position of the Broncos defense. Vic Fangio said he's the type of guy that wants to learn everything, and I think that increases his value to getting on the field. Now, there's obviously some storylines we're going to address a little bit later on in the show about how the Broncos can maybe get all these cornerbacks on the field at the same time together. But Patrick Surtain, one of the other key additions. So the Broncos go deep in cornerback this offseason through free agency and also the NFL draft. They also added Carrie Vincent Jr. as a 7th-round pick out of LSU. We'll talk about him a little bit later on as the show progresses. But those are the 3 key additions to that position. Now let's take a look at the departures. Ajimundi was released by the Broncos, and obviously he was dealing with the suspension. He's going to be suspended the first 2 games of the season anyways, but he was a key offseason acquisition. I felt like last year in his limited sample size, I thought Bouye did pretty well for the Broncos. He gave up a few catches, but his contested coverage was there. I mean, he was there making contested plays. He created opportunities. He was the reason that Sang Bassi got his first career interception against the New Orleans Saints in that game. Great coverage against Michael Thomas, but unfortunately the suspension with the Peds, he was 6 games out. 2 games at the beginning of this season, the Broncos said, hey, we can't wait around. And, we're going to move and we're going to go in a different direction. This was in John Elway's signing. And George Payton said, hey, I'm going a different direction. So Bouye is gone. Also, another key departure for the Broncos, Devontae Bosby, who last year I felt like had such an up and down roller coaster type season. At the beginning of the year, when there were some injuries to the Broncos secondary and Devontae Bosby had to come in and play on the outside, it allowed Bryce Callahan to move inside the nickel. And then you had Michael Ajimudi on the outside with Bouye's injury. Bosby played pretty well, specifically against the New York Jets. Now, there were some games where he gave up catches, sometimes was slow to react. And I think that's a combination of thinking too much. But I felt like Bosby had some developmental traits to him. I was a big fan of Bosby, by the way. And like I said, it just didn't work out in Denver, and he got an opportunity to get some more time down the stretch, and he struggled against the Los Angeles Chargers in that Week 16 game, gave up some catches, was benched for Parnell Motley, and the rest is history. And Devontae Bosby right now no longer a Denver Broncos, so obviously you lose a guy in that room. Is it a key departure? I mean, maybe you can make the argument. I was a big Devontae Bosby stan. Loved what I saw from him on film. He could react quickly to some things, but sometimes paralysis by analysis was something that impacted him from making that next step and even contributing in a bigger role for the Broncos defense last season. So want to wish Devontae Bosby, Ajimundi the best of luck wherever they are at now. But now the Broncos defensive back room is loaded, and coming up here in just a moment, we're going to take a look at the cornerback depth as is. We're going to project who the active roster players will be in 2021, who may be on the practice squad, and we're going to talk about what specific roles these players may have coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, folks, I have to tell you about one of the sponsors of today's episode of the show. That's our good friends over there at Built Bar, and Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar that is out there on the market. And did you know that Built Bar has so many delicious flavors? There is something for everyone. My personal favorite was peanut butter brownie, but that is no longer in the rotation. So I have now switched it up to cookies and cream. They've also added German chocolate. They have strawberry, salted caramel, double chocolate, mint brownie, raspberry cherry barcia, and coconut brownie. And they also have a limited time flavor with the grasshopper cookie, which is a version of the classic thin mint cookie. And I want you to get your hands on a box of Built Bar today. Not only are Built Bars the best tasting protein bars out there, they're also the healthiest. They contain 17 grams of protein, only 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. And you can get your hands on a box of Built Bar today by going to Built.com and use promo code LOCKED15 at checkout. And that's going to get you 15% off your next order. Once again, LOCKED15 is going to get you 15% off your next order at Built.com. Taking a look at the Broncos training camp roster at the cornerback position, we talk about wide receiver, and usually those are the 2 positions that have the most depth going into training camp. You're going to see 14 to 15 guys. The Broncos at this point, they have quite a few. So we're going to go through the players. We're going to give a little bit of a synopsis on their type of role, the expectation they may have. Then we're going to get into projecting the active roster and also the practice squad, or who may be cut after training camp is over here. But take a look here. Patrick Surtain, we talk about him, the Alabama ball hawking cornerback. He's a cerebral guy, has some really great traits to him, lengthy, sizable, physical, and that's been the talk of the offseason amongst Broncos players like Von Miller. Every defensive player we've talked to in our media scrums has said that Pat Surtain looks like the real deal. So now we're excited to see here in just a couple of weeks him at training camp going against Jerry Jeudy. Because look, once you get to training camp, you're going to have some physicality. You're allowed to have contact and bang around a little bit. You're going to see some great one-on-one reps there. I'm looking forward to seeing that. I'm looking forward to seeing how these players do in team periods, whether it's the first team defense against the first team offense or the first team D against the second team O. You're going to see a lot of these players rotate in and out. You're going to see a lot of Patrick Surtain working on the outside, also working in a little bit of the inside, and could be in some safety packages depending on what the Broncos decide to do with their DB sets. There's also some opportunities for them to be very creative with how they use him. He could be a Swiss Army knife. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Vic Fangio and Ed Donatell, they have some big plans for Patrick Surtain. So Broncos fans should be excited about him. Ronald Darby, we talked about him. There's going to be some competition between these cornerbacks here in training camp. Now, I think right now we're looking at the writing on the wall. Everyone's going to say, well, who's cornerback 1? Who's cornerback 2? Who's cornerback 3, 4, 5? Here's the deal. I think you can have a depth chart initially, and that's what's going to happen after the Broncos start practicing more and preseason approaches. They're going to release their first depth chart. It's unofficial. It is always going to be contingent upon changing from a week-to-week basis here. But I think when you look at all these cornerbacks for the Broncos on their roster, you can't get into the idea as a fan saying, okay, hey, this guy's a cornerback 1, this guy's cornerback 2, because all of these cornerbacks, up to 5 of them, I think are going to play a lot here in 2021, whether it be in a base package, whether it be in their nickel or their dime, whether they get really creative, especially in the goal line situation. They're going to find ways to maximize the talent that they have, and they have a very talented cornerback room as it stands today. So they're going to see how many guys they can get up. A lot of it's going to be contingent upon the matchups. I mean, we could see Patrick Surtain going against Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, covering those guys specifically. And then you have Ronald Darby and those other guys floating in, Kyle Fuller, Bryce Callahan, and other positions covering different guys trying to take away the next biggest threat. I think that the Broncos defense is so well suited with Kareem Jackson and Justin Simmons on the back end. They can be very aggressive this year with playing some more press man-to-man coverage with the cornerback position. So Ronald Darby can play that. He can play on the outside. He can play on the inside. And then you factor in Bryce Callahan, who was one of the NFL's top cornerbacks last season, despite the fact that he missed 6 games. He played in 10 for the Broncos. The hope is that he can play a full-on season this year. And for Bryce, we talked to him this offseason. He said, more than anything, he wishes that he didn't have to deal with some injuries, but it's the nature of the game. And while I understand personally, but by a guy who's also been injured in his career, injuries are something that you can't control. Now, you can do a lot of things. You can do strength and conditioning. You can stay as healthy as possible. But the reality, at the end of the day, in a physical, violent contact sport, you're going to have a chance to have an injury, and you have to manage it right. And I think for Bryce Callahan, for him, was just these uncircumstantial events that have happened to him so far in the last couple of years that have really impacted him. But he is 110% fully healthy. He's ready to go for this upcoming season, and he excelled last year for the Broncos, both playing on the outside and on the inside. So we'll see what he can do this year. But I imagine even if the Broncos have all this depth, we may see Bryce Callahan play specifically just on the inside and the slot and the nickel. And it may actually preserve his shelf life if, in fact, the Broncos can utilize all of these talented DBs that they currently have on the roster on paper, right? The on-field product, these guys have to go out there, they have to perform, they have to execute. But right now on paper, they have one of the best secondaries in the league. I think it's really, really hard to argue at this point. Now you add in Kyle Fuller, his former teammate in Chicago, who knows Ed Donatell, who knows Vic Fangio's defense super well, coming off of a little bit of an odd year for him, especially in coming off of Chuck Pagano's defense down there in Chicago. His best year was with Vic Fangio. He had 7 interceptions, 21 passes defensed, and a 68.7 quarterback rating when targeting. He really excelled in Vic's defense, so there is hope here, especially at 29 years of age, that he can come back into Vic's defense, pick up really where he left off back in 2018 after having a really dominant season. That whole defense, whether it be Bryce Callahan, Eddie Jackson, Kyle Fuller, I mean, those guys were all over the place in terms of having one of the best secondaries, one of the best scoring defenses in the National Football League. Vic is hoping that with Von Miller, Bradley Chubb on the outside of the defense, if they can stay healthy, the guys that they have in the secondary, that they can be that unit here in 2021. There's a strong chance it could happen, but there are so many different factors that will come into whether or not that can actually happen for the Broncos this upcoming season. Now we get to Michael Ajimundi, and I feel like he's often lost in the mix of the discussion amongst Broncos fans because of the fact that they went out and they signed Darby, Fuller, and they drafted Patrick Surtain. Michael Ajimundi is still going to have a big role, and that's what Ed Donatell had told us during mandatory minicamp in a press conference. He said that he's been very impressed with how he's responded to having all this competition. He's been learning the nickel and the dime position, the slot, and he's also still able to contribute on the outside. So Michael Ajimundi will be a player that will see time on the field, even if he doesn't start. I believe he's going to be an impact playmaker for the Broncos defense this upcoming season, specifically with Vic and Ed Donatell. I feel like blitzing him off the edge or inside from the slot, I think it'll add another dynamic to this Broncos defense here in 2021. Duke Dawson, obviously coming off of a complete knee reconstruction. Not sure if he's going to be ready to go for training camp. Obviously, he's going through the rehab process. The Broncos, they aren't rushing him back, which is a great thing. He's taking his time, and when he's ready, he'll be ready. But he can obviously play inside that hybrid role as what Michael Ajimundi will more than likely be doing this upcoming season. He can play safety. He can play corner. He can do all these things. And obviously, the former second-round pick, Vic Fangio and Ed Donatel, they see something in him, and they want to keep him close to the belt here. Saying Bassey's coming off ACL as well. He was in mandatory minicamp practice. Didn't do too much. He's going to be eased into training camp because once it gets a little bit more physical, there's banging, there's contact involved. You want to be careful with these guys that are coming off of contact injuries, and that's exactly, well, in Bassey's case, it was a non-contact ACL tear, but you want to reduce that because contact adds a whole nother dynamic in terms of taking your angles and also planting the force, the amount of physicality that you use to plant your foot into the ground, specifically when you're coming up against the run. You can re-aggravate something really easily. Nate Hairston's a fifth-year veteran coming over for the Broncos as well. He was released a little bit this offseason with a roster technicality and then was brought back the next day. He's going to be a depth option there. He's a veteran player, but more than likely we will see him in preseason, but I don't think he's going to maintain on the active roster unless it is on the practice squad. Then Parnell Motley, who was signed off the 49ers practice squad last year, was able to get in after Bosby got benched against the Los Angeles Chargers. He started against the Las Vegas Raiders the next week. He's a high-energy guy. He's a high-effort guy. He gave up some big plays against the Raiders, but he also had a lot of effort. There's some things that you can develop with him. He's a young enough player. You can stash him on the practice squad and still continue to work with him. I think that's what we're going to see from him. Then you have Mccain III and Carrie Vincent Jr., obviously two players there. Mccain, obviously a rookie for the Broncos this season. Don't think he's going to be a guy more so than just a camp body. I think we'll see him in some preseason action, maybe after the first game. We may not even see him on the roster after game number 1 against the Minnesota Vikings. But Carrie Vincent Jr. is also a player that the Broncos got in the 7th round. Very speedy, 4.3 speed, runs downfield, and can be a key contributor on the special team side of the ball for Tom McMahon as a gunner on kickoff. He could also have some return elements, and we're going to see him get some reps in training camp as well in just a couple weeks' time here. But Broncos country, my active roster projections here: Patrick Surtain, Ronald Darby, Bryce Callahan, Kyle Fuller, Michael Ojimundi, and Asang Bassey. I think that Duke Dawson will start off the season physically unable to perform this. That will keep his roster spot protected at this point in time. And I think we're going to see Parnell Motley and Carrie Vincent Jr. on the practice squad, considering it goes from 11 to 16. Obviously, the same carryover rules from last year where 16 players were allowed on the practice squad. You could designate certain players for protection to where other teams can't come in and steal them. But that will be the training camp roster here for the Denver Broncos in 2021. Now, coming up here in just a moment, Broncos country, we're going to go over some of the storylines specific to the cornerback position. We're going to provide some questions. We're going to be eager for your feedback in the comment section down below on the YouTube channel. But we're going to get that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, folks, I have to tell you about the other sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. That's our good friends over there, rockauto.com. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts that you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand that their warehouse happens to carry, when you have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket? And you can save time and money when using rockauto.com. Why choose to spend 30%, 50%, or even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or a car dealership? And rockauto.com is a family-owned business that's been serving auto parts customers online for over 20 years. They know how to do business. They've been serving do-it-yourselfers for a very long time. That's why I rock with rockauto.com. And rockauto.com prices are reliably low for every customer, and they have everything you can need, whether it's brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, or even new carpet. So go explore their easy-to-use website today to find the solution for your auto parts needs. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On Broncos in their How Did You Hear About Us box so that they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Continuing with our Broncos training camp preview, we're taking a look at the cornerback position today. We've gone over what our active roster projections would be, maybe the practice squad, the storylines of the key additions, departures, and now we're going to focus on the position-specific storylines. And Broncos country, this is where your feedback in the comment section down below here on YouTube is going to be important. We want to hear what you have to say. This is the Broncos show that gets you involved as a fan, especially as a media member. I believe in giving fans a platform for their voice to be heard, for the team that they root for on Sunday. Starting things off here, the first storyline, I think this is on everybody's mind. Does Patrick Surtain start week 1 against the New York Giants? Well, I think when you look at the New York Giants' emphasis this offseason, they still have Evan Ingram. They've added Kadarius Toney to the mix there. They have a variety of different receivers. John Ross now on the roster. And I think that you have a variety of different weapons that you're probably going to see 3 or 4 different wide receiver rotations in New York this season, not to mention Saquon Barkley is back. Now, for me, I want to look at it a couple ways here. Is Patrick Surtain ready to start week 1? Well, I think a lot of it depends on how the training camp process goes for him, also preseason. But on paper, I mean, it's really hard to ignore as a first-round pick that he's not going to be starting week 1. The Broncos, they went out and they got him at that price, at that point in round number 1 with other options that were available on the table. You have to make sure he is on the field week 1. And I think that's for a defensive side of the ball, you can make the argument a little bit better, maybe than an offensive side of the ball. Specifically right now with the Chicago Bears, everyone's going to be talking about whether or not Justin Fields is going to start week 1. And if he doesn't, I think that there's going to be a lot of conversations that people have as to maybe why the Broncos did what they did. And if he does start and then lights it up, people are going to have the same conversation. So for Denver, it's a lose-lose in those optics, but I think that you have to tune that out. You have to really focus on Pat Surtain. He is a player that, in my opinion, and this is where I really value Champ Bailey's feedback, because obviously a Hall of Fame cornerback, one of the best to ever do it. I had a chance to watch his film, just some career highlights last week, and I was just blown away. Champ Bailey says raving things about Pat Surtain and says he has the potential to be a very, very dominant player in the NFL. I'm going to take Champ's word for that because he understands cornerback play. He understands talent. And a lot of players don't play like Champ anymore. So maybe Champ Bailey gets a little bit invested in potentially mentoring, tutoring, or even providing some aid with Pat Surtain. Not that he necessarily needs it, but it'd be a great addition to have. So for me, I personally believe that Pat Surtain will start week 1 against the Giants. I think that for him, he's mature enough to be able to handle the responsibilities of Vic Fangio, Ed Donatel want him to do and to succeed at. And he's going to have some struggles this season. I want Broncos fans to understand. I want to be very clear here. He is a rookie. And just like that, even if he was a veteran player, cornerback, when you play that position, you're going to get beat sometimes. You're going to give up some big plays. Broncos fans, I hope, don't get to the point where if he gets burnt for a 25-yard play or gives up a touchdown, that people are going to say, oh, why did the Broncos draft him? That's the low-hanging fruit. Please, let's be better than that in our discussion. So, Pat Surtain, week 1, I would put money on it to be able to do that for him to start against the New York Giants. Now, our second storyline is going to be, what are the expectations for Bryce Callahan in the final year of his deal? I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I think with all the additions of the Broncos' depth, with Asang Bassi coming back and also playing in that nickel and that slot role, I think that the Broncos, they're going to figure out how to maybe reduce the overall number of snaps that Bryce Callahan has. Now, obviously, if he's fully healthy and he's playing really well, it's going to be hard to say, hey, come off the field on this because, we want to make sure that we're taking a look at your snap count and making sure that you don't have any additional wear and tear throughout the season. I just don't believe that's a very valuable thing to do as an organization if you're really trying to monitor the snap counts that players have, unless it is for their best interest. Now, for Bryce Callahan, if he's fully healthy, I don't think that you look at that situation. But I do think that the Broncos have to see this year, and if Bryce Callahan can play every single game this year and plays at a high level, he's going to get an extension with the team. There's no question about it. You'd be foolish not to. But if he doesn't maintain being able to play every single game this upcoming season, I think that you have to really look at maybe getting a replacement in the future, which, look, I don't like saying, hey, you need to replace this guy, but the Broncos have to keep in mind, if Bryce is on his final year of his deal and he is not playing well, or if he is injured, it is risky as an organization to say, hey, let's give you an extension, even though that when he is on the field, his value to the team is astronomical. The Broncos defense is so much better with Bryce on the field, but however, you can't make the club from the top. So we'll see if Bryce can stay healthy. That's my hope. And my expectation for him is that he plays in every single game this year. He plays well. The Broncos reward him with an extension. Keep the secondary together. Keep in mind, he did take a team-friendly deal. He restructured his contract. I believe it was after 2019 to be able to help the team out. I think that is a sign of good faith. And in terms of the eyes of the Broncos front office, we'll see how things go with Bryce this upcoming season. Our next one is, how many cornerbacks will be on the field at the same time? Well, Ed Donatel, Vic Fangio, they talked about in their press conferences this offseason throughout the summer, mandatory minicamp practice, voluntary OTAs, and they were talking about it's a good problem to have and really trying to figure out, how do we get this guy in the field? Who do we put where, right? I think that's really the big dilemma here, because I think when we look at the initial depth of a defense, we look at a dime package. Obviously, dime has 6 DBs. Do you take a safety like Kareem Jackson out the field and keep Justin Simmons in there and have 5 cornerbacks in there? I think that maybe you play around with that, but I don't know if you want to reinvent the wheel necessarily. So I think for the Broncos, they're going to find a way to have Pat Surtain on the field, Bryce Callahan, Kyle Fuller on the field, and also I think Ronald Darby at times. I mean, you could really see that in the Broncos dime package. But the question for me that I have is, how do you get a guy like Michael Ajimundi onto the field? Now, right now, I have no idea because we don't know how the rotation is going to play out. We could see the Broncos coaches get really creative with rotating guys in different series, keeping guys fresh. How often is that, done in the NFL? I don't think it happens too often, but with the Broncos depth that they do have, it might be a possibility. So we'll keep an eye on that. And then our final one will be in terms of Michael Ajimundi. He will have a big role despite not starting. And whether it be, he will play a lot of special teams for the Broncos this upcoming season. That's been discussed. He is going to play in that nickel role. So there may be even times where we see Michael Ajimundi come down into the box as if he's a linebacker. But I did mention earlier that I think that Vic Fangio, Ed Donatil, they will utilize him on some blitzes because he's a sizable, physical guy. And he's also had a knack to be able to find the football and knock it free to create opportunities for the Broncos to get takeaways. And he was a big presence last year for that, obviously, with 4 forced fumbles. He is a physical guy, and I tell you what, I love watching Michael Ajimundi on film, and I think that he's going to help the Broncos defense in a big way this season, even if it is not in a big-time starting role. His impact will be big. And Broncos country, I want to know what your thoughts are. Let me know in the YouTube comments here down below. Tweet me on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Locked On Broncos. We've continued our position preview with the defensive side of the ball this week. We talked cornerbacks today. On tomorrow's episode of Locked On Broncos, we're going to talk about the safety position. We're taking a look at Justin Simmons, Kareem Jackson, the guys behind them, and how the Broncos can get creative with maybe how many safeties they use this upcoming season. We project the roster, we break it down. But that'll be on tomorrow's episode of the show. But in the meantime, Broncos country, if you love today's episode of the show, make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit the thumbs up button, and make sure you turn on notifications. Anytime Locked On Broncos has a new episode, we got you covered every single day. You're going to get an episode drop a day early of the podcast, 4 p.m. Mountain Time on the YouTube channel, Locked On Broncos. We're close to 4K subscribers. And once we get to 5K, I will be doing a jersey giveaway to one lucky Broncos fan, whether it be a male or a female. We get a men's jersey, a women's jersey, and they get to choose the player, and I will get it shipped out directly to their doorstep once we get to 5K. And you can only do that by making sure that you're subscribed to the Locked On Broncos podcast here on YouTube and also on your favorite audio podcasting platform, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or the Odyssey app. But with that said, Broncos country, I'm Cody Roark, host of the show. I'll see you tomorrow as we talk about the Broncos safeties heading into training camp.